This is Sunday afternoon, April the 18th, 2021. I'm going to try to experiment here. I'm going to try and take a book that Denise helped put together on a legacy of questions and answers that she presented to me through a friend of hers on lifetime activities. It's kind of a novel approach, and I don't like to read things, but I'm going to use it for reference. Here's the book I'm referring to. It's a little hard to get on the camera here, but it's in a notebook form now, and it was made, well, you can see May 19 or 2018. So as we went on with the book, it had a list of questions, and I'm going to kind of talk a little sideways because I'm going to looking at the book at the same time I'm recording this on my Zoom camera. Um, my name is Donald Roy Russell, the full blast. Why were you given that name? Donald was my mother's brother's name, who died at birth, and Roy was my dad's brother's name, my Uncle Roy, who was born, by the way, in 1880, a long time ago. Um, what are the names of your parents and your siblings? Well, my dad's name was Case Clay Russell, and he was born in 1889 and passed away in 1958. My mother's name was Anna Louise Rusk Russell. She was born in 1895 and passed away in 1987. Uh, my sister Anne Laverne was named after my mother's sister, and Anne Laverne Shirk was born in 1924, 4 years before me, making her the senior member of the group. And she was passed away in 2018. My brother Cash Dwayne Russell got my dad's name, which was Cash, and he was born in 1930 and passed away in 2010. And then there was Sally Jane, the youngest one. Sally was named after a neighbor in a small town in Ohio. We lived at East Palestine, and that neighbor was popular to all the neighborhood, took care of all the kids in the neighborhood when they had to have a 6-year-old tooth pulled and so forth. Anyhow, uh, Sally was born in 1936 and passed away in 2010. That means that I'm the only surviving of the four members of our family. Um, what are your special family's name? Well, I guess we didn't go much for that, and didn't have any nicknames. How did we decide to name our children? Well, we used some name books. Man, a lot of names that were present and popular at the time period that they were born in the 1950s. Uh, John Charles's family name was from both sides. My mother's brother, a favorite uncle who had recently lost his life in an auto accident, Uncle Charles, and the uh, Lee and Roy for Marsh and Tom were Glada and my middle names, so they got stuck with them. What about my parents? Well, one of the unusual features is that they were older when they got married, and that meant that we had older parents, and we didn't have any grandparents. I shouldn't say we didn't have any grandparents. Um, my one grandmother, my father's mother, passed away, and get this, in 1894 when he was only 5 years old. That's quite a few years before my 1928 birth. Um, my mother's mother died when she was in her 40s, so she didn't live to old age, and she died many years before I came on board. And her husband, my grandfather, also passed away shortly after that. And so all three of those grandparents passed away many years before I even came aboard. One grandparent, my father's father, passed away when I was about 5 years old. I can just beginning to remember that as the beginning of time for my mental capacity. And when I can remember, they had caskets at that time in living rooms at family houses, and that was kind of a thing that kind of struck me hard as a 5 year old. But I never really got to know him because he passed away after living in these later years in a relative's house at aunt and uncle's in Evansville, Indiana. And so I don't think I've ever got to see him, even as a youngster, that in that age level. So I missed having grandparents. I was always jealous and envious of those who were so fortunate to have grandparents, kind of spoiling them. And so that doesn't mean I'm not spoiled. It just means that different people worked me over. Um, what about your brothers and sisters? Well, altogether there was four of us. Ann was 4 years older than I, and yet she was our high school teacher in our senior year at high school. During World War II, students who were learning the teacher field could get a temporary certificate, and they could leave school after 3 years with the promise they would go back and finish their degree. And she come under that need that was created by World War II, which was active at that time. And so she became the bookkeeping, typing teacher for my senior class. Uh, Somewhat because of it, boys didn't take typing in those years. That was kind of a sissy class to take, but I had two or three buddies that did. That was the greatest mistake probably of my life because I had never learned how to type, and I should have. Today everybody needs to know how to type, and they do in school. But back in 1945, 46, boys were not customarily taking typing or shorthand or the other type bookkeeping classes. Anyhow, she did teach my class. So when we had reunions in later years for our high school class, and we brought teachers back, my sister Ann got invited back as a teacher, even though she wasn't only 4 years older than my classmates. Um, my brother Dwayne was 2 years younger than me, and that made us real buddies. We did everything together. Even went to the same college at Ohio University. I preceded him after being in the Army for a year and a half, right after World War II. And so he almost caught up with me, not quite, but I graduated from college in 1951, and Dwayne graduated in 1952, which was pretty close behind. Both of us, Dwayne and I, had a fraternity that we belonged to because our father, being a Mason, appreciated Masonic affiliated fraternities. And the Acacia Fraternity, which is a national men's fraternity, had a chapter at High University at Athens. And even though my brother belonged to it for 3 years, my father suggested that since he was going to underwrite something in my college career, he'd like me to join into a fraternity. And I did so only as a senior. I point that out because even though Gleda and I got married in 1948, I was only a sophomore in college. I'd come back from the Army and was going to college on the GI Bill. Gleda had finished medical laboratory training in Columbus, Ohio, and so she was able to get a position with a doctor in Athens. And we spent 3 of my 4 years at Ohio University as married. That was not unusual because after World War II, many of the veterans were married, and it was very common to have married students in those 1946, 1951 period. You had married dorms and a lot of married apartments. Uh, my younger sister was 8 years younger, and she was still way behind us at that particular stage. She came in another generation almost entirely. And so Sally was the spoiled one, left over at home, all with parents all to herself, as the rest of us had already departed for adult education and so forth. My brother Dwayne had the misfortune of having serious rheumatic fever when he was in, I think, junior high school. It left him with a bad heart, a heart valve problem. It made him such that he didn't not only didn't have to get drafted for the Korean War, but he wasn't even eligible. He was what was classified as 4F, and it always troubled him because he would have liked to gone in the military and was not eligible. Uh, Dwayne fought heart trouble all of his life and died finally from a little bit of heart trouble when he was in his 70s. So he survived a whole lifetime of having heart trouble somewhat hanging over his head. Not really bad heart trouble, but knowing that it was there at all times. Um, Sally was kind of a tomboy in a way. For example, she played the bass drum in the high school band. That's not exactly a girl's job, but she did do that. She beat on that bass drum, and it was a popular event for her senior year. She had a nice circle of friends who still contact me when they come around her birthday anniversary time. So she did have a very tight, close knit group of friends, and ended up starting to high U where Dwayne and I went, but she didn't like it. She called home and asked to be brought back to Newcomerstown where we live, and decided then to go enroll at Ohio State, which she thought would be a better deal for her. Turned out to be a real good deal for her because even though I don't think she carried out graduation, she did nail down her husband Bob Maddox, and they met at Ohio State. And had she not transferred from Ohio U to Ohio State, that very nice marriageable get together would never have occurred. And so it's strange how things happen, but that worked out for the best. Um, Another question, number 10 here says, describe the personalities of your family members. Well, I've sort of done that. Ann being 4 years the senior of me, who I was number 2 in the lineup, uh, she's downright bossy. And she had to be, really, because during World War II, the facility, a brick plant in Newcomerstown, had to shut down for the whole duration of war. In other words, they weren't building houses and so forth. They didn't need brick. So all brick plants just plain folded up for the duration, as we called it. And at that particular time, the oldest person in the family, if there was multiple children, and there was obviously, they had to kind of help supervise the children more than they normally would. My mother had her hands full with having 4 kids in grade school and high school at the same time in those war years, and they were years that we can easily remember with a great deal of the problems that are created by such a horrible event. Uh, to deviate a little bit from some of the questions here, during World War II, we had to make a lot of sacrifices. I don't mean a little bit, I mean a lot. We had ration stamps. Meat was rationed. It's hard to believe that you had to have stamps to buy hamburgers, but you did. And it was not uncommon for people that had farm people to buy sections of beef and have it run through a frozen locker, and you had your own locker in town, and adult children or older children got the job going to the locker, and it's hard to believe today that you got a freezer in your kitchen, but in those days, if you had a frozen food system, it usually was in a conventional locker plant where you had to go into a cooled area and open a big old door that was your locker, and you had beef in there and any other minor frozen foods that weren't real common in those days. World War II meant that tires were rationed, gas was rationed, everybody had a stamp on their car, deciding how much they were contributing to I guess, the war. Average person had a big old A stamp on their car, and someone that worked in a war plant 20 miles away got a C stamp for additional gas. My father did work in a plant in Akron, which was a 2-hour drive at that time, and we had a C stamp. He had enough gas allocation that he could come home on weekends. So we missed our father from Monday through Friday. And he came home on Friday nights and was there for Saturday and Sunday, went back to Akron on Sunday night. And he worked in a defense plant that made oxygen cylinders for aircraft. In those days, there was so much aircraft being built, and to have oxygen in an aircraft, and that may be true today, uh, they have special stainless steel dome shaped cylinders. And the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company made those in a special plant they had converted in Akron. My dad was a supervisor in that. He had been superintendent of a brick plant, so he was used to being in a supervisory position, and he was able to secure a foreman's type job for the Firestone Company in Akron, making these oxygen cylinders by the literally thousands that were placed in military aircraft. They were strange in the such that the cylinders that were made to carry the oxygen had a steel strap welded around them. And I often wonder what's the steel strap spirally wound around all those tanks. And it was so that if the oxygen got hit by fragments or shrapnel when they were shooting at them, that the oxygen tank wouldn't burst. It had secondary strength, and it wouldn't fracture and create secondary fragments, which everything was designed because the planes were somewhat designed to take on fire, shells and fire. And it was a hard thing to have war come that close to you that your father's working and making aircraft cylinders. But he did that for the whole duration of the war, working for Firestone and traveling back and forth to Newcomerstown before the war ended, when the brick plant could start back up in Newcomerstown. During World War II, um, when I was a junior, well, be a sophomore. When I was a sophomore in high school, I became 16 on June the 16th that summer, and that day made me eligible to work in a war plant myself. It's hard to believe, a 16-year-old working on summer schools, but that far down the ladder on your schooling, you could work in a military defense plant. But you could. They needed help that bad, and so I too relocated for the week with my father, and he lived with an aunt and uncle for the duration, and room and boarded with them in the home they had already in Akron. And so I too stayed with the same aunt and uncle. And when I got a job that first summer between my sophomore and junior summers, I went to work on my 16th birthday, and continued to work all that first summer making metal shell casings. These shell casings were for 105 millimeter big anti-air or aircraft type cylinders, and the cylinders, one shell was put in one cylinder, and when they landed for howitzers to be used on the war, these shells were protected in these special cylinders, which we constructed. I helped roll steel and actually made a section of that cylinder, and they were waterproofed, and they were made by the thousands for these big, huge howitzer shells. I didn't know at the time, didn't have the slightest idea that when I got in the Army just a couple of years later, that I would be assigned to 105 millimeter field artillery unit at Fort Knox training. And I ended up getting to handle those shells as we had crews loading 105 millimeter big howitzers out in the field, and got training in actually shooting the gun. So it seemed odd to me that just 2 years earlier I had helped make landing craft containers as such for these same size shells. A 105 millimeter shell, by the way, is a pretty big size shell. I could probably describe it better in inches if I knew the conversion, and I can't grab it that quick. But it is a big hunk of artillery, and when you fire them there, you better have some earmuffs on because it is not exactly a quiet process. It took a three-man crew and an officer to figure out the sighting, but my whole career in the Army basic training was in 105 millimeter howitzer training. Not exactly a good place to be when there's a war, but I didn't have to face that, unfortunately. Going on to some other questions here. Describe a typical family dinner. Did you eat together as a family, and who did the cooking, and what were your favorite foods? Well, Sunday was always the major meal of the week, and after church, we always went to church, Sunday school church. Um, my mother did all the cooking, and everyone was required to be there. No absentee on Sunday for dinner. Better figure something else out. No excuses. Now, this is school age children, not adult children. My favorite meal happened to be ham loaf and scalloped potatoes, and my mom always knew that. So she, even when I became back to visit as an adult, you can bet your boots that she'd have that ham loaf and scalloped potatoes, and it was my number one meal. Now I don't even know if you can get ham loaf. You probably could under special conditions, and I know that the Heritage does not know what ham loaf is, and they have trouble with their meatloaf. Um, my mother had a special formula for getting her ham loaves ground at a local Newcomers Town small butcher shop. I don't know, most towns, besides having a grocery store, had a specialty shop, and there's almost, even in the smallest of towns, a butcher shop, which had all kind of meat, and you can get all kind of custom things made, like meatloaf or ham loaf to your formula. And so we benefited heavily by having that butcher shop in town during the war, even during the war years with the coupons. What holidays were celebrated by your family? Did your family have special traditions? Well, it's a rule that you had to avoid business trips on holidays. I'm talking now being an adult when the kids were raised. They probably don't know it now, but when you plan your business day, you better have a really good excuse. That's Clayton's rule, not to avoid birthday dates. You that just wasn't something that you decided to go out and play a game of golf with a friend. It just didn't work that way. Um, Clayton had a lot of food rules that she set up, all good ones that she did so well. Uh, One of the traditions we had in our Russell family, my dad always got a live Christmas tree. He went shopping for it the day before Christmas every year. And then he would kind of hide the Christmas tree out in the garage, I guess. And after we went to bed, then he become Santa Claus's helper, and he and my mother put up the tree and got the stand out and did the chopping on the end to get it just right and level off, and discussed which part of the tree didn't look good and twisted and turned, and put the lights on it all in late evening on Christmas Eve. We were already all to bed, and we didn't get to see the Christmas tree until Christmas morning. That just was the way it was year after year after year. And so when I finally got married and we bought the artificial tree, that smell is just not there unless you buy a spray can with pine smell in it. But I can still mentally smell the pine smell from those natural trees. There's just something about them that's invigorating. No one was allowed to come out in the room where the Christmas presents was at. All the presents were out, and some big toys were quite visible. And we had to line up somewhere in away from the living room in order to, at the right time, it was announced, and we came out in mass, all four of us, to enjoy what Santa Claus had worked so hard to bring us. This tradition went on for year after year. Um, when we got older, we liked the kids to come out like that too. But one of the things they had to wait for wasn't whether I had the Christmas tree in place. Vince had got an artificial tree. But I had movie lights. And those movie lights was about four big bright lights on a stand that you had the camera mounted on, and they literally would give the kids sunburns. We had one Christmas where they got a good coast of light exposure, and they looked very healthy for a couple of days after my escapade with the home movie camera lights. Um, the Who was the oldest relative you can remember as a child? Well, I've already stated I didn't remember my grandparents where they normally would be, and so I didn't have a lot of access to very old people. Uh, However, in later years, I found out that I had a great 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 grandparent that was buried in Gettysburg at the age of 99 in 1860. Gettysburg then becomes beside the Gettysburg Address. And in later years, my sister Sally found the gravesite, and we all on tours to Gettysburg to see the National uh, Cemetery at Gettysburg went to that particular gravesite after she pinpointed the tombstone. She was of German descent, and her two sons migrated from Gettysburg area to Ohio, and that's where our roots got established, was in Ohio, as those German descendants went to Ohio. A side note on that particular episode is that the two children had letters written to them in German by that mother that back in the mid 1800s, kind of bawling them out for not communicating enough. I don't know how they communicated at all. And she wrote a letter to them in German and kind of gave them a rundown on not keeping in touch enough. That letter became documented, and somewhere in the family legacy is an interpretation by other members of the family who knew German, which we didn't. Uh, that letter is on record that she wrote back in like 1850 or something like that, relative to those boys running off on a train trip and stayed in Ohio. Um, was there any physical characteristics that run in the family? I hate to mention this to the kids, but hearing is a family problem. It wasn't on my father's side at all. He didn't have a hearing problem, but my mother and her family all were born with deficient hearing. During World War II, with the advance of electronics starting up, hearing aids became available. And it was the first time in my mother's life that she really had anything that would help her with her hearing difficulty. She had some of the first hearing aids that I remember. They were big as Army walkie-talkies, which were huge, and I don't see how she could put up with carrying them around. When I think that my current hearing aids do so much uh, for improving my hearing, and with such little effort. When I say little effort, those hearing aids are wireless. There's no wires dangling down chargers, the wee little batteries they have. Um, when I get a telephone call, it automatically will come right into my hearing aids. It's just amazing the difference between this and what my mother had to put up with her hearing aids back at World War II period. She would get new hearing aids every couple of years almost because of the advancement in them. So she almost became an expert hearing aids. Uh, I can tell that there's some heredity to the problem. Uh, John's, our John, his hearing has slipped a little, to say the least. And I'm sorry that that's happened, but I'm sure we can attribute that not to the work environment, but to the hearing. I like to, when I first started losing my hearing ability, maybe in my 40s, my first thought was to blame it on the 105 millimeter howitzer boom, but we did have earmuffs on when we was using those earplugs, and I don't think that had anything to do with it. I wouldn't want to tell the VA that in case I someday need some hearing aids from them. But the hearing is a family problem. Anne had hearing problems. Dwayne had hearing problems. Sally did not have any hearing problems. And so it isn't 100%, but it doesn't help to be from the Rusk side of the family. My uncle Charles, my mother's brother, had bad hearing problems. My aunt Laverne, the other member of her family, had hearing problems. So there wasn't no question about the fact that there was a hearing loss heredity wise in the Rusk family. Are there any special heirloom photos, Bibles, and other memorabilia that have been passed down through the family? Two brothers, my distant uncles, received a letter from their mother written in German that I was just referring to and scolding them out. That letter still exists. We do not have a copy of it, but there is some copies of it in the Historical Society. Denise also has my first bedroom suit where they were married in my mother's when they married in 1924. I didn't check lately, have not been there for a while, whether that still exists or whether she's advanced beyond that. Um, I have been able to check into some family members through Legacy and checking out. And we have some cousins that live in the Evansville, Indiana area yet that have been fairly successful. One of those members of that family, that'd be my dad's brother's family, um, they have a family Bible. And it's interesting to know that many years went by before I even knew that a family Bible of the Russells existed. And I still have never seen the Bible, but I did request and get pictures of the documentary pages, which was customary in those family Bibles. One of the main uses they used them for, beside biblical reference, was in the back pages of those Bibles was placed to put the birth and the deaths of various members of the family. And that whole Russell family has been documented in those Bibles. And it's interesting because my grandmother, who passed away in 1894, was a member of a 16 children family, all by one mother. This was before and after the Civil War. My grandmother Russell was named Boffman. It'd be on my mother's side, and the Boffmans had 16 children. That'd be my great grandparents, and they had children that were born just before the Civil War, and he was in the Civil War, and then they had more children after it. Those are all documented by birth and death in that family Bible, and my records that I have achieved have been transferred to documentation in my computer of all those births and deaths, including my grandmother's, which was back well, a long time ago. She died when she was 42, and so that threw her back into the Civil War period. Um, so it's interesting to know that years go on and some of the documentation shows up from odd sources. What stories have come down to you about your parents and grandmother? My mother's dad, Charles Rusk, ran a grocery store in Shawnee, Ohio, a very small village in Perry County, which is not too far from Logan, where we spent 40 or so years of our career. And so I always had the connection of the old family area in Shawnee. My grandparents are buried at Shawnee, and I had the pleasure and honor of taking care of their graves for several years, being the closest relative to those sites in later adult years. Uh, so it's always interesting. When I was a child, we were taken back every Memorial Day as a kind of a community get together uh, at the cemetery. They had a parade to go out a mile or two from town and to the cemetery in the hills. And we as little kids would go along, and we met a lot of my dad's old time friends. It was basically a reunion deal for everybody as they wandered over that cemetery. I suppose there's cemeteries that still do that, but that become a tradition for us to be taken as children back to Shawnee, Ohio, to visit my grandparents' graves. Um, One of the people that stayed for years in Shawnee, Ohio, when I was a youngster, was was my mother's brother, my uncle Charles Rusk, and he and my aunt Jane, his wife, and they were kind of secondary parents to us because they had no children, unfortunately. And when summer came and they wanted to get rid of us, so to speak, the little kids, they farmed us out for a week at the time in the summer to them. And so I became well acquainted with this little community of Shawnee and its hills and valleys in the little community of Perry County in Ohio. But Shawnee's probably not very famous, but I'm told at one time it had big as many 5,000 people. It certainly probably has trouble finding 500 now. And it has a lot of old homes and so forth, which we used to go all over town visiting relatives that I didn't understand the connections, mostly cousins and so forth, that my dad had and wanted to visit with. But we being my brother and my particularly spent summers visiting in Shawnee under the help and that of my aunt Jane and Uncle Charles. They were very church oriented and gave us a lot of good real guidance back in those years. They were very interested in your scholastic input and what you were doing. Even when you went to college, they were paying attention. Yet they were still living. Um, are there any stories about famous relatives in your family? Well, we aren't related to President Eisenhower, but we did have a great great uncle that was a former Secretary of Agriculture under Abe Lincoln. Now, you haven't lived till your great great uncle has been the Secretary of Agriculture under uh, Abe Lincoln, but we were. Uh, my uncle Roy, that I was got my middle name from, uh, got his name, I'm told, from a vice president, and he became a vice president himself of a MPT company, the major national grocery at the time. Matter of fact, we used to have an AMP in Logan. I think they're now probably got gobbled up by other companies. Have there been any recipes that have been passed down through the family? I've already mentioned that the ham loaf, but my mom baked the best cherry pie in town. I really believe that, and I miss it. Heritage does not know how to make a just plain simple everyday cherry pie. They make little tarts instead. Uh, and somehow, I don't know how she did it in the refrigerator, but she made pineapple sherbet. Goodness, that was great. Pineapple sherbet and some cherry pie. Man, yeah, that was really living. Glade always duplicated somewhat, and Glade always liked to be famous for her chocolate chip and butterscotch chip cookies, her noodles, her pie crust and vegetable soup, and her punch recipes. I'm referring to my wife Glade now. So she was a tremendous cook, and I miss her diet, uh, custom diet, a great deal in my senior years without her. Uh, where's our family from originally? Well, the Russells, they settled in Virginia and then Shawnee because they were coal mining people, and coal mining was a big item in Shawnee back at the turn of the other century. Uh, Grandma Laura's mother, Buna Vista Warner, came from Germany, and Sarah Bartlett, my granddaughter, has the original chest that Grandma Warner brought over from Germany with her only belongings on that ship. So we've handed down a piece of history by way of Sarah, which I assume she probably still has the chest, but it was given to Glado and handed to her, and she gave it to Sarah, who wanted it years ago. How did we get to be located where we are today? Well, you got to go back to my dad's occupation. My dad spent his whole career in the brick manufacturing business. We lived in Newcomerstown when I was born. He then moved to Illinois for a brick plant in the Ottawa, Illinois area. And then from Ottawa, Illinois, when I was about 5 years old, we moved to East Palestine, where we stayed until I was in the fourth grade. When I was in the fourth grade, we moved from East Palestine to New Philadelphia, Ohio. New Philadelphia had a brick plant near it, and my dad was manager of that brick plant. He kept taking other brick plant jobs for other companies. This is not the same company, but as he would learn the ropes of how to make better brick, why somebody else would hire him, and away we go. We'd move. After we lived in New Philadelphia for 3 years, we moved to Newcomerstown, again, another brick plant, where we stayed throughout the rest of my uh, young adult life until I graduated from high school and went to the Army. And that's where I met Gleda. We were in the seventh grade together. We were in the eighth grade together, being R for Russell and W for Whitish, which was her maiden name. We sat relatively close together and we got to know each other in the seventh and eighth grade pretty well. By the time we became freshmen in high school, we got to know each other real well. And we were dating regularly. So you might say we actually were steadies throughout our high school years and had planned on getting hitched someday without too much doubt at all. Matter of fact, when we were seniors in high school, they had a senior advisor, them out of town, that come and told the facts of life and everything about life. And one of the statements they made is, "You couples who are going together, uh, get it out of your head because you're just experiencing some puppy love. In later years, you're not going to, you'll have other people." Well, we didn't have other people. Matter of fact, we resented the statement. And after I'd been in the Army for a year and a half and got started to college and was able to get her a job to help me out in college, uh, we did get married in 1948. And I was in college at the time. We got married at Christmas time in 1948. Um, Even though I was lived in Newcomerstown when I was born, the hospital was in Coshocton, so my birth record showed Coshocton, Ohio, as the place of our June 16th, 1928 birth. Sally was born in Salem, Ohio. Dwayne was born in Ottawa, Illinois, and so those. And Ann was born in Newcomerstown the first time we lived in Newcomerstown. We lived in Newcomerstown twice. We lived in Newcomerstown when Ann was born and I was youngster, and then we came back to Newcomerstown in later years. As strange as that may seem, the jobs make their circle.